set up, like, if we think about like GitHub Actions, right? There's a couple different use cases of them. One is like it can act as an alternative to prefect slash airflow, or kind of like kick off. And we saw that with that code base I shared, right? Kick off prefect tasks for us, right? Or even really the prefect flow, right? Simply by running, like defining a prefect flow and then just running Python and then the name of that flow, right? It's a little more complicated than that, right? We'll have to install prefect, make sure that we log in, etc. But then it can kick this off. And so what it's really serving as is kind of like our orchestrator server, right? Like instead of deploying prefect or airflow to an EC2 machine and running it, we can have GitHub Actions like on a schedule. Just use its computer essentially when the time is right, and it will run Python flow.py, etc. Okay, so they can act as kind of like our orchestrator server, you know, and that's like a good use case for them. Another use case is kind of like what we're doing a lot of, which is like CI/CD, right? Continuous integration, deployment, right? And just remember the integration part. When we say integration, we mean basically like testing. And then deployment, we know what that means. So that's what we're moving through today. And one thing to note is like, so GitHub Actions, if you're just thinking of it as how it compares to Prefect, like I said, it can kind of serve as an alternative, but originally it was really designed as like event driven, you know, meaning that when you push, right, on the event of pushing to the main branch, right, on like a triggering event, I want to now take these steps, okay? And right, which really fits in nicely with CI/CD. So what are we going to do today? Well, this is the whole shebang. Like this is going to be spread across like 2 different lessons, but you can see like what needs to occur for us to do. This isn't even all of CI/CD, but it's basically like continuous deployment. So you can see like what would have to occur if we say make changes to some code, and then we want that code not only to be deployed to AWS. So the steps that I have are like, first you need to check out and download the repository. So we kind of can use this actions checkout step to do that. Then we're going to need to like log in to AWS. So the reason for that is because ultimately we want to take the code that we've created, build an image out of it, and then push that image up to ECR, okay? And then we want to set up our infrastructure, right? We're going to want to take that image, have it get pulled onto an EC2 machine, and to do that, we should probably do like use Terraform, and then remember we have that user data component in Terraform. I wonder if I have it here. We have that user data component in Terraform that basically once the EC2 is booted up, right, then we can update that. This is going to become more complicated, but we're going to need to pull from our ECR, right, that AWS repository. So those are the steps, you know, and then we need to start up that image once it's on our EC2 machine. So those are really like the steps that we need to take. And like I said, it's mainly like a walkthrough. Like the reading ideally like gives you all these steps, like tells you exactly what to type essentially for you to do it. But conceptually, I want you to like understand and think through all the steps that need to occur, right? So it's like Dockerize the image, push that Docker image up to our ECR account. Then we want the infrastructure set up, so that's what Terraform is for. And then not only can it like set up our infrastructure, meaning like our EC2, potentially an RDS if you wanted it, but then also it can, because of that user data component, right, we can install, say when the EC2 is set up, install Docker and pull down that Docker image, Okay, and just remember, like what we previously had to do in Terraform to do that, we had to do all this stuff with the roles, right? Making sure that that we have permission from the EC2 machine to access ECR, right, and things like that. Okay, so this is like a pretty good review thing. Now, the reason why this takes like 2 lessons to explain is because we kind of have to do something a little bit new in order to set this up. So what you can think about is like our GitHub account is going to need to access AWS, okay? And typically what AWS requires, right, is going to require 2 different things. One is for GitHub to log into AWS, and then the other thing is, once we are logged in, what are we allowed to do on with our AWS services? So what are we allowed to do with our AWS services? That's what we've been talking about previously. That's just a role, okay? Now the login part, that's going to be something new. That's called like creating an identity provider. But really the way you can think about that is like OAuth, really just like logging into a website. And this is like GitHub Actions logging into AWS. And that's kind of the way you can think of it. We need to create an interface so that GitHub Actions can log into AWS, and once it's logged in, allow it to assume a role, this user to like assume a role so that it can set up our infrastructure using Terraform. In other words, so that when we call like Terraform apply, it has the permission to actually create an EC2 machine, etc. Okay? So there's really these 2 steps, right? This is the logging in part, the identity provider. I'll just write it here. The identity provider to integrate GitHub Actions with AWS. 2 steps. One is logging in, and then 2 is like permissions once logged in. So the logging in part, you can literally just think of a login page, okay? And that's the identity provider in AWS. And then the permissions, once we're logged in, that's the role. So we're going to need to create both. All right, so let me show you, and the reading, like I said, kind of walks you directly through this. I'm not even sure if I can do this without looking at the reading, so you'll just basically follow the tutorial. But what you'll do is you go to IAM, Identity and Access Management, and then you'll click on Identity Providers. Okay, so that's a different thing than we've seen so far. Then the next thing you'll click on is Add Provider, and then this is OpenID Connect is what you'll want to select. It says establish trust between your AWS account and identity provider services such as Google or Salesforce. We're using GitHub Actions, which also uses this as like a format. It also uses OpenID Connect. Then we want to say like who is trying to log in, all right? And that's going to be that's going to be this thing. So it's our GitHub Actions token is what's going to try to log in. And then the audience is actually like an AWS component, like where is GitHub Actions going to be sending like the request to log in, and that's this secure token service from Amazon. All right, then you have to click this Get Thumbprint. For me, it'll break because I already did this, but you'll click Get Thumbprint and then you'll click Add Provider, and that will add a new provider here. So that will be the first step, which is like allow GitHub Actions to actually log into AWS, right? That will be this component. We're going to log into AWS. The next step is then to create a role. So for that, you'll click on Roles. You'll click on Create Role. You're going to click on Web Identity this time. So you can kind of see what this says. Allow users federated by the specific external web identity provider to assume this role to perform actions on this account, right? So it's like specified by an external web identity provider. That's GitHub, right? To assume this role to like take on this key card and perform actions to this account. And then you have to use your identity provider, like who is logging in. So that's where you'll select the account that the identity provider that you just specified. And then the audience is the same, it's like, what is this sending the request to? Like to log in, and that's our secure token service. Now this is important, right? You're going to want to put, we're not saying like any account from GitHub can log in, but we're specifying exactly who. So for me, it's like Jigsaw Labs student, and then the GitHub repository you should also do. So I have another one maybe I can use. So like we could also do this AWS login code one. So do this guy. Ugh, that was not right. All right, and then I'll click next. And then I need to say what access. So we kind of basically just took care of like the assume role part, like saying that GitHub can assume this role and that it can log in, and which repository can log in. And now we're going to say I'm just going to give it administrator access. In real life, you probably would want to make it more restrictive, but here, and you can call this my like actions role, or GitHub actions role. So you can see what's been generated here. So the principle is that federated user, right? This is the actor, okay, that can assume the role. And it's like, you can see it says tokens, actions, GitHub user content. So it's coming from GitHub. And then the condition is like what GitHub is sending over here. And it's sending a request to, this is the audience, right, to my secure token service. And then this is saying, what is the repository that's sending the request to? Like, what conditions, right? What does it have to meet in order to even get this request? It has to be coming from Jigsaw Lab student, actions, AWS code. This is saying any branch. That star there, so that looks good. And then we click, can click create role. This role, if I can, let's click view role, gives me an ARN, okay? So we just kind of said like, hey, we're going to let a repo assume this role. The next thing is then we want to tell our GitHub Actions to actually log in as this role, okay? So that's kind of what we do next. So for that part, you'll go to this GitHub Actions. You can kind of see the steps. You'll use this. So one, we'll check out the code, right? That will download the repository onto your GitHub Actions. Two, you're then going to use another kind of like pre-built GitHub Actions thing, which is this configure AWS credentials. And it says the role to assume is the IAM role. Okay, so what is this thing? You're going to say the role to assume is this guy right here. But you don't want to, so you just use the ARN. So this is going to allow GitHub Actions to assume this role that has administrator access. All right, and then when it tries to assume that role, it's AWS will look to make sure that it's coming. Remember what we said, that it has to come from that GitHub, from this GitHub and this repository. Okay, so it's going to check to make sure it comes from this GitHub and this repository. So you can see I'm using this secrets thing, right? I'm trying to read secrets. Where the secrets set up, you have to go over to to actions deploy, and then probably settings, and then down here there's secrets and variables. Okay, so I'm going to click on actions, and then here's my IAM role. Okay, and this is what's in here is this value, is the value right here. All right, so basically what it's doing is when you say role to assume, it's reading from the secrets the IAM role, which translates to this value. So it's trying to assume that role, and then the next step I do, right, change this to be the region that you want. That's where your IAM role is defined, and the services you want to perform. And then the next step I'm using is just, you're basically logged in if this works. And the next step I'm doing is just double checking by then logging into my ECR. So at this point I have admin access. The next step I'm doing is just logging into my repository, and then in the following lesson we go through the steps of like calling Terraform init and Terraform apply and all those steps. That's essential. I mean, I know that's a lot. I don't expect you to remember too much of that. But what I do kind of want you to conceptually understand is basically what each step is used for, right? So it makes a little bit of sense, right? Identity provider is how is GitHub Actions going to log in? Like, what's the login interface for it? And then once it logs in, what can it do, right? What role can it assume? All right. And like I said, this reading should walk you through everything, like everything to type in, etc. And then from there, you can move on to the next reading, which is filling out the rest of Terraform, okay? And or filling up the rest of our GitHub actions, meaning like we're going to need to like, you'll see, we're going to need to do a good amount of steps. All right. Moving through this is going to, like, doing this in the context of a classroom is going to be helpful because hopefully it will give you some confidence that you can do something like this, like set up a CI/CD pipeline for another organization. So Scobius, where did I specify the secrets I am role, right? That's in, if you go to your repository that you're setting up with CI/CD, then you just go to settings and then you go to secrets.
Yeah, I got that part, but where in
the actions?
In AWS, you're telling AWS, isn't it right? You're also specifying the secret.im role in AWS, I thought.
No, so AWS is providing that for us, right? So we already wrote this role, right? This GitHub Actions role. That has administrator access and that has like this assume role policy that says that, GitHub Actions can assume this role. And then it gives us this ARN. So this is what it's what GitHub Actions is going to try to assume that role.
But in the JSON that you showed, you've got literally secrets dot, where was it? No, it's not there.
Are you talking about this
is the YAML?
The YAML file right here.
There, yeah, the YAML, sorry.
Mm-hmm. So it's going to try, when it logs in, it's going to try to assume this role. And then, so we'll request a token from AWS, and then AWS will look to see, right, okay, who's allowed to kind of assume this role. Yeah, I mean, I'm just for the rest of the class too. So, it says, first of all, we want to check that it's trying to make a request to the secure token service, and then it's also going to look to make sure that, this is coming from this repository and this account, GitHub account, and this repository. All right.
Yeah,
so it really does have to be like, no, it's cool.
I didn't catch it.
It's a good question.
On to the Terraform.
Yeah, so there has to be like a handshake, So it's like on this side, we're specifying the repository, and on this side, we're specifying the ARN. Okay. Cool. And that's why, by the way, like I tried to use my code earlier to I was like, I just want to test this thing out. So I tried to use my existing role on a different repository, and it of course broke, right? Even though everything was set up, I had the secret set up, but it broke because when it came to GitHub Actions, it was then looking to make sure the request came from the right repository. And unless, you have to specify, or you don't have to, you could say any repository, but you probably should say, I want it to come from this repository in your account. All right, so this might take a little to move through.